My name is Heatherly, and I was cooking dinner for my son when he walked in and asked a question that made me freeze over the stove. He said clearly and casually, "Mom, can I have the blue gum Aunt Linda gave me?" I stared at him, the heat from the stove fading as uneasiness climbed up my spine. He had never mentioned anything like that before, and I had never heard him talk about my aunt in that tone. I slid the pan away from direct heat and asked again, "Aunt Linda gave you that?" He nodded without hesitation and added a line that tightened every muscle in my body. "Yeah." It makes the room spin. A 10-year-old should not feel dizzy from something described as gum, so my mind raced through every possible explanation, none of them safe. I thought about an adverse reaction, unregulated samples, or someone letting a child try something without understanding the consequences. I shouted down the hallway, "Call 911 now." I grabbed my son, guided him toward the door, tried to keep him alert, and refused to waste a second on excuses. If you are a parent who has ever been forced to act instantly because your child's safety mattered more than waiting for explanations, subscribe and share your experience. The ride to the emergency department took longer than it should have because traffic slowed near an intersection, although my mind barely registered the delay. The attending nurse brought us through a triage room and began asking for the exact name of the item Mason had taken the time he received it, and whether he had experienced dizziness before today. I tried to answer without sounding defensive, because I did not want to create the impression that I blamed family without proof. The nurse wanted a description of the packaging, so I told her that he referred to it as gum and that I did not see any container at home. She asked if it came from a wellness store or pediatric clinic. I said I did not know. The doctor joined the assessment and asked how long the sensation of spinning lasted, whether Mason felt nausea, and whether the gum increased his alertness. The mention of spinning caught his interest, and he asked permission to document it as a neurological point of observation rather than a statement of classification. I agreed because nothing would be gained by arguing terminology when our priority was safety. The doctor explained that certain unverified products can cause sensory distortion in children, and that the facility needed to treat the symptom before identifying any source. I was asked to contact the person who gave Mason the item, although the instruction came carefully phrased so that it did not sound accusatory. The request made me pause. Mason may have confused a different adult for Linda, and speaking to her while still unsure could turn an emergency visit into a family dispute. I said I preferred to wait until we confirmed basic laboratory readings. The doctor accepted the hesitation and focused on stabilizing Mason first. Mason participated in a short neurological evaluation. He followed the doctor's finger with both eyes, answered slow questions about school, and squeezed when asked. The measurements showed a normal response for a child his age, although the doctor warned me that normal results did not eliminate concern. He told me that adults must avoid introducing unregulated substances to children because developing systems respond unpredictably, which can escalate into more serious complications if repeated without supervision. His tone never accused me directly, but it emphasized responsibility in a way that felt sharp beneath my ribs. The doctor then asked a question that altered my internal balance. He said, "Who gave him that?" The sentence came without frustration, yet it pressed against the uncertainty I tried to ignore. I understood the implication. If Mason received something today, then someone made that decision, and hospitals require accountability because ambiguity prevents treatment. I could not claim ignorance without sounding negligent, yet naming Linda without certainty could damage trust. I told the doctor that Mason mentioned a relative and that I needed time before identifying them. He wrote a note into the chart without visible judgment. Mason remained in observation for a period while the doctor monitored his pupils and hydration. When he no longer expressed visual distortion, we were released with written instructions. The packet warned against providing minors with supplements that lacked regulatory approval, encouraged reading product labels, and advised parents to dispose of unidentified items rather than keep them for casual access. The final page instructed me to return immediately if Mason experienced renewed spinning fatigue, shortness of breath, or headaches. Leaving the emergency department did not relieve uncertainty. The medical staff provided competent care, yet none of them could answer the question that followed me into the parking lot. Someone handed Mason something that altered his senses. If it came from Linda, then a conversation awaited. If it did not, then either my son misremembered or someone acted without permission. The instructions in my hand reminded me that adults must intervene before misplaced trust becomes risk. The air outside felt heavier than the drive in because I now carried the responsibility of sorting truth from confusion. I guided Mason into the car, helped him fasten his belt, and started the engine. The possibility that he might minimize the event frightened me more than the hospital tests. I needed clarity, yet I needed calm. Until I confirmed what he received and who provided it, hesitation remained necessary. The drive home felt longer than the arterial route on the map because uncertainty stretches distance. When we reached the house, I understood that this night marked a line between assuming safety and verifying it. One day after the hospital visit, I tried to settle my thoughts before making any phone calls because I wanted to avoid sounding accusatory before having actual information. I waited until Mason finished breakfast and his energy looked normal enough for me to leave him with a neighbor, and only when I stepped outside with space to breathe did I dial the number belonging to Linda, who had always enjoyed positioning herself as the carefree relative nobody should question. I introduced myself with a steady tone and told her I needed a moment to discuss something involving Mason because I wanted to understand whether she had recently given him anything he might have misunderstood as gum. The silence on the other end lasted a little longer than usual, and when she finally responded, her voice had that familiar casual lift that suggested nothing in the world could possibly warrant seriousness. She told me that Mason probably grabbed something silly from the kitchen counter, and she claimed that children often make up phrases when they want attention. I repeated the same words Mason had used because I wanted accuracy rather than interpretation. I told her, "He said it makes the room spin." Linda responded with a small laugh, suggesting that Mason probably meant he felt excited or dizzy from running around, and she implied that interpreting childhood exaggeration as a medical problem showed a lack of maternal composure. I tried to push the conversation toward factual clarity because the hospital staff wanted source information instead of emotional evaluations. I asked her whether she had recently brought anything labeled as supplements, wellness samples, or unfamiliar candy, and whether she remembered handing Mason something that could create a noticeable physical sensation. Rather than answering directly, Linda's tone shifted toward light dismissal. She advised me not to turn minor behavior into a household drama and suggested that parents who constantly evaluate risk end up raising anxious children. She ignored the part about hospital monitoring, which forced me to take a slow breath and decide whether further questioning would lead anywhere productive. My initial frustration evolved into a form of pragmatic observation. Linda preferred interpretations that protected her self-image rather than information that required accountability. She did not ask about Mason's symptoms, nor did she show interest in medical recommendations. She moved the topic toward personality judgment, suggesting that Mason gravitated to her because she represented freedom from structure. The implication was subtle, but persistent, as if a lack of supervision deserved praise rather than caution. I realized that pressing for explanations would only encourage Linda to frame me as someone who created tension when none should exist. I thanked her for taking the call, even though the conversation provided nothing measurable. My goal never involved blaming her before confirming evidence. What I wanted was confirmation about products, and what I received was commentary about childhood imagination. When I hung up, I understood that verbal cooperation from Linda would remain unlikely, and treating her as a reliable witness would not help me interpret medical risks. The lack of concern suggested that the most responsible next step would be independent fact-finding rather than emotional confrontation. I returned home with a notebook. and rewrote the hospital instructions so I could compare Mason's behavior over the next several days. If dizziness returned, I would contact the emergency department immediately rather than ask relatives to validate my instincts. I placed a call to his pediatrician's office because I wanted documentation of ongoing symptoms, and I asked for guidance regarding unidentified consumables. The nurse reminded me to monitor hydration pupil response and verbal clarity, because evaluating neurological function requires patterns rather than isolated anecdotes. The more she spoke, the less I cared about relatives who valued denial. The next priority involved reviewing household access, evaluating pantry items, and restricting unsupervised contact with anyone who might offer products casually. I did not accuse Linda directly, because accusations without confirmation weaken credibility when seeking support from medical personnel. What mattered was behavioral protection rather than emotional compromise. That afternoon, I watched Mason complete his math worksheet with a consistent attention span, which reassured me that no immediate neurological decline existed. Concern remained, however, because recovery does not confirm origin. I understood that families often protect comfort rather than truth, and I recognized the responsibility of documenting every occurrence myself. A few days later, I sat at the dining table with my laptop open and a document pulled up that listed the balance history for Mason's savings account because the emergency room discharge note instructed me to monitor anything he might have consumed and also watch for behavioral shifts that could point toward exposure to something that had a physiological impact. I scrolled down through the most recent entries, expecting nothing more than the usual deposit from the small allowance I gave him for chores. But my eyes landed on a withdrawal, marked as a fee for a supposed health sample. Mason did not have the authority to approve transactions from this account, and I had never connected him to any program that would authorize funds to leave without explicit parental consent. That moment sent a cold feeling down my spine because it was the first concrete financial sign that something was happening outside my view. I enlarged the entry on the screen, reread the words that attempted to label the withdrawal as something legitimate, and connected the dots that had been circling in my mind since the night in the kitchen when Mason said the phrase that had changed everything. I refused to make assumptions without evidence, so I clicked on the contact information tied to the transaction and recognized the last name immediately. The record referenced someone I knew well, and it became clear that the person to ask was my cousin, Bruce Carter. I dialed his number, waited through a long ring cycle, and introduced myself without raising my voice. I said that I had discovered a withdrawal from Mason's savings account that listed a health sample fee, and I wanted clarification before involving the bank. Bruce gave a low laugh that suggested he did not take my tone seriously, and told me that it was nothing more than support for a trial Linda was helping push through her professional network. His tone sounded like someone who insisted that helping family meant endorsing side ventures without asking questions, and he described it as an opportunity that should be appreciated. When I reminded him that Mason was not of legal age to authorize financial participation in anything resembling a trial, he responded with a line that dismissed the entire concern. He said that nothing was wrong, and that I should avoid adding stress by overthinking a harmless contribution. I drew a breath, chose not to raise my volume, and explained that minors could not be used as financial channels to support adult experimentation in wellness fields because the law required consent oversight and transparency. Bruce shifted his tone into something slightly defensive, although he did not escalate beyond insinuating that my need for clarity was disruptive. He avoided specifics and did not deny Linda's involvement, yet he tried to wrap his explanation in the language of business support instead of acknowledging that a 10-year-old child should never be positioned as a participant in anything involving samples, wellness projects, or financial activity. I ended the call politely because the conversation had already revealed what it needed to reveal. Bruce did not ask about Mason's well-being. Bruce did not request medical updates. Bruce did not inquire about the emergency room visit, and Bruce did not acknowledge the phrase about the room spinning. The only subject he valued was the preservation of a small financial current that benefited Linda's venture. That realization stopped me from attributing Linda's actions to a careless boundary breach. It was not an aunt handing out a questionable product because she lacked judgment. It was a person who attached economic interest to exposure. The withdrawal in Mason's account marked the moment my concern became anchored in proof. If money could leave a child's account without review, then the wellness story did not live in the realm of kindness. It lived in the realm of gain. I closed the laptop without making dramatic movements because in that silence I understood that the problem did not begin with Mason's sentence about spinning or Linda's cheerful dismissal. It began with access, and now I knew someone had treated a child's bank account like part of a budget plan. A week later, I walked into Mason's elementary school during the afternoon block, when parents were allowed to request administrative conversations without interrupting classroom instruction, and I asked for a meeting with the school counselor, Porter Grant, because the medical guidance I received pointed me toward documenting any verbal descriptions Mason offered about exposure to an unfamiliar product. Porter welcomed me into his office with a professional posture that did not rely on emotional sympathy, and I explained that I needed a formal record rather than a family argument since Mason had said a flavored item made the room spin, and I wanted the school to register the statement before memories blurred or became subject to casual dismissal. Porter listened without interruption, asked for the phrasing Mason used, and recorded my explanation in a structured note rather than treating it as hearsay. He told me that statements connected to a child's physical state, especially dizziness caused by a consumable item, could be filed as a wellness concern that triggered mandatory documentation. Porter did not encourage speculation about motives inside a family, and instead explained that the school's responsibility was to log indicators, cross-reference them with behavioral changes, and elevate the file to a district contact if an outside product had been introduced without medical clearance. His approach replaced my anxiety with the clarity that comes from procedure because nothing he said depended on whether Linda found the story funny or exaggerated. Porter explained that once a parent submitted a verbal account like mine, the next step involved connecting with a designated social services figure who could determine if the situation required external review. He placed a short call and secured an appointment slot with the caseworker, Foster Hale. Foster received the matter as a potential product exposure case, not as a family conflict, and asked me to describe dates, language, and observable reactions. Foster clarified that the goal was not to accuse relatives or prosecute misunderstandings, but to investigate whether a minor received an unregulated product for promotional or trial purposes, because that crossed into a domain where children could be treated as sampling subjects without legal protection. Foster outlined potential procedures that could follow if the situation met investigative thresholds. These procedures included examining whether an adult distributed consumable items without labeling, whether financial involvement occurred through a minor's account, and whether the adult who supplied the product had business motivations that bypassed parental consent. Foster did not promise punitive action and did not encourage emotional reactivity. His language stayed in the realm of statute liability and child welfare standards. That tone helped me recognize that the matter was no longer personal frustration but a question of compliance. When Foster finished the initial intake, I asked about timelines. He explained that the next 7 to 10 days would determine whether the description qualified for a substantiated review or whether the statement would rest as a filed concern. That period would involve comparing notes from the school, the medical intake document, and the brief statement Mason gave. Foster recommended that I refrain from direct confrontation with Linda because ongoing contact might compromise memory clarity or create claims of parental influence. His instruction did not protect my comfort, it protected the evidentiary chain. I left the meeting without adrenaline because I no longer needed adrenaline. The documentation removed the burden of persuading family members who preferred financial narratives. Now the responsibility shifted toward people who used state guidelines rather than casual impressions. If Foster concluded that the situation met review criteria, the next step would involve outreach, and if Foster determined that the situation fell below mandate, the record would still remain inside the system for future reference. Foster scheduled a deadline for the preliminary decision and informed me that I would receive either a phone call requesting further statements or an email indicating that the matter had moved into a formal inquiry. The structure of that deadline became the point on which my patience balanced, because it determined whether the situation would remain a private betrayal or expand into a public consequence. When I walked out of the building, I understood that waiting for that deadline meant waiting to see whether accountability would travel beyond a kitchen conversation and become a matter of record. 2 weeks later, I walked into a community center that held open attendance sessions for adults who wanted to hear informal presentations on wellness products, and I recognized Linda near a portable table where she arranged small packets, glossy pamphlets, and a handwritten sign that promoted natural support for clarity and energy. I sat among people who did not know anything about the arguments that had taken place inside my family, and I understood that this environment had nothing to do with private emotion. It functioned as a space where claims met curiosity, and curiosity met the expectation of evidence. Linda greeted the room with a voice that aimed for confident warmth, and she introduced herself as someone who embraced a holistic philosophy that rejected unnecessary pharmaceuticals. She encouraged the audience to become ambassadors for clean inputs that strengthened daily function. I did not speak or glare because my presence had no performative purpose. I wanted to see what happened when questions replaced admiration, and when a claim about safety met the obligation to support it. A woman near the front raised her hand and asked Linda if she could reference any certification authority that approved her product for adult consumption. Linda responded with a circular explanation about natural ingredients that did not require heavy regulation because they had a botanical origin. The room did not clap. The absence of response produced a pause that Linda tried to fill with an invitation to trust intuition. The woman who asked the first question remained unimpressed and asked why Linda did not describe dosage. Another participant followed with a question about the exclusion of laboratory data. Linda attempted to soften the tension by saying that research sometimes lagged behind discovery, but the room did not reward that line. The shift occurred when a man asked whether Linda's sample kits were used in trials with minors. He phrased it with clinical detachment, and he did not glance sideways at anyone, which turned the question into an objective concern, rather than a personal accusation. Linda reacted with visible discomfort, and she tried to reduce the question to paranoia. She asked why anyone would imagine that children were involved in a clean product demonstration, yet she did not offer a denial that sounded grounded in compliance language. She claimed that her outreach was family-friendly, which unintentionally brought the question closer to her. Bruce moved toward the front of the room and explained that the project included a voluntary contribution framework, which allowed relatives to support the sample effort. A member of the audience asked him to display the paperwork that authorized financial access from a minor, and Bruce did not produce anything. A different attendee asked whether Bruce could confirm parental consent forms. Another asked about insurance. Bruce tried to redirect the topic toward enthusiasm for health autonomy, but his phrasing sounded brittle, and the absence of documentation became louder than any reassurance he attempted. No one shouted. No one insulted them. The power of the room came from the stillness that followed each inadequate answer. Linda did not face a legal reprimand or public humiliation through mockery. She faced something colder. She faced the universal expectation that a wellness claim must survive scrutiny. When she asked whether anyone wanted to sign up for the distribution chain, no one moved. When she tried to pass out her small packets, people leaned back rather than forward. The silence did not punish her. It invalidated her. I remained seated without triumph. I did not need catharsis. I needed a setting where belief depended on verification. Linda gathered her materials with a stiffness that revealed her discomfort. Bruce ended the session with a comment about entrepreneurial courage, Yet even he looked relieved when the room began to empty. I walked out without speaking to them because the room had done everything that emotion could not. I wanted clarity, and clarity arrived when strangers treated a claim as something that required structure. If Linda continued her effort, she would face the disappointment of groups that demanded evidence. If she stopped, she would do so because the market refused to participate in improvisation. I did not need revenge. I needed consequence, and consequence arrived through silence. 1 month later, I sat at a narrow table with Mason beside me, and the case materials that Foster prepared were arranged in folders where each action had a reference line. The hearing officer opened with the purpose of the session, which centered on evaluating exposure risk for a minor and determining whether future oversight should be mandated as a preventative measure. The matter felt simple in theory, yet the air had that tension produced by a party that did not accept measurable consequence. Foster presented an overview that focused on regulatory language rather than moral outrage. He clarified that distributing an unverified consumable to a child constituted a breach of health safety, and that the standard of evaluation became more strict once a financial transaction entered the chain of involvement. He pointed out that any adult who gained monetary benefit through a product should be prepared to satisfy proof requirements. He repeated that the state had no interest in criminal punishment for novelty items, yet it had a duty to secure a boundary that protected minors from experimentation designed to further a business model. His voice never rose, and he did not seek a confession. He treated the event as a matter of undeniable record. Linda responded with a claim that her intention had been supportive and creative, and that Mason was never in jeopardy. She spoke as though risk were a narrative choice rather than a compliance criterion. She asked why imagination could not be honored. Foster explained that imagination was irrelevant when oversight existed for a reason, and that parental consent remained the authority. Linda tried to characterize the entire interpretation as hysteria, which created a visible shift in the hearing officer's posture. Once the transcript recorded that Linda dismissed the regulatory basis as emotional panic, the room viewed her explanation as subjective noise rather than data. Bruce attempted to reposition himself as a facilitator who merely streamlined family generosity, but Foster brought the financial statement forward and demonstrated that the withdrawal did not originate with a legal signature from a custodial adult. The hearing officer asked Bruce whether he held notarized permissions that assigned him the right to approve expenses on behalf of a minor. Bruce tried a rhetorical construction about entrepreneurial eagerness, but the officer asked him to acknowledge the absence of authorization. The silence that followed served as the acknowledgement. The determination phase proceeded without ceremony. The hearing officer stated that Linda would receive a prohibition on unsupervised contact with Mason until further notice. The purpose of that prohibition was not punishment but precaution, and it operated as a boundary that removed ambiguity about access. Bruce would be restricted from any financial interface involving minors, and his name would not appear as an agent for withdrawals. The decision stated that the restriction could be reviewed after a period of demonstrated compliance. Foster described that structure as a no-contact guidance that prioritized safety without enforcing punitive stigma. I was not told to apologize or provide emotional closure. I was simply granted the authority to maintain a boundary without negotiation. Linda reacted with a glare that carried more disbelief than heartbreak, and she asked how a family could participate in a system that refused to trust goodwill. The officer reminded her that goodwill was not a credential. She requested an exception for casual visits, yet Foster clarified that unsupervised access would violate the directive. Her posture stiffened in the way people brace against humiliation, yet no one mocked her. The decision did not scold her. It only removed discretion because she proved unable to exercise it responsibly. The session ended when Linda signed a copy of the acknowledgement form. She signed it with pressure that bent the pen, and Bruce read his section twice before placing his signature beneath language that eliminated his financial pathway. Their reactions did not change the ink. The authority did not belong to belief. It belonged to compliance. I left the room with Mason, and I did not feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt the steadiness that arrives when a system converts risk into structure. The consequence was not theatrical, it was administrative, and administration often succeeds where emotion fails. Months later, I understood how distance could mature a wound into a boundary. Mason adjusted to that transition with a quiet pace, although it took time for his vocabulary to reflect a sense of safety rather than curiosity. He remained aware of how adults could influence his access to novelty. His attention now centered on school weekend exercise and short routines that helped guide his energy into predictable comfort rather than anxious anticipation. He stopped referring to the blue gum after the first few weeks, and that silence carried a form of closure that none of us had to orchestrate. I encouraged new habits in our conversation shaped around simple talk about ingredients, store labels, and visible logs of where things originated. When I handed Mason anything unfamiliar, I asked where he saw it, who mentioned it, how he interpreted the purpose, and what he assumed about its effect. He responded without dramatic tension. He allowed those questions to settle through his own sense of control. Sometimes I noticed that he paused whenever a colorful item appeared in a shopping aisle, although he no longer demanded access the way he used to. He compared wrappers, nutritional notes, and error-free spelling. Those small acts helped him navigate information without falling into blind trust. Silence from Linda continued. That absence did not create longing. It produced structure. I no longer checked messages from Bruce for hints about requests or financial concerns. There was nothing to respond to. The legal guidance outlined in the decision did not require mediation or apology. It did not push me to reframe the memory as a misunderstanding. It acknowledged a threshold between choice and accountability. I followed the instructions without resentment. The no-contact guidance did not function as a punishment for any of us. It ensured that Mason could develop under clarity rather than persuasion. I observed how households tend to reorganize themselves when incentives disappear. Linda had no access to a child she attempted to influence. Bruce carried no authority over accounts that did not belong to him. Their silence indicated a recognition of limitation. If emotional protest had remained a priority, I would have heard it. Instead, I received nothing. I accepted that outcome because quiet can replace conflict when the structure does not require reaction. I did not discuss any of these details with Mason. He did not require explanation. He only required attention from a parent who monitored risk with steadiness. Several months passed before I recognized the subtle emotional shift that followed the hearing. My appetite for confrontation disappeared. I no longer rehearsed arguments in private thought. I stopped evaluating how Linda might redirect blame. There was no longer an audience for justification. Absence erased that need. I measured progress through Mason's language. One afternoon, he mentioned that a classmate offered a chewable supplement during recess. He declined. He said he did not know the source. He said that he did not want unexpected consequences. His voice remained calm. I congratulated him without turning the moment into moral theater. That restraint carried meaning. He understood his freedom without associating it with shame. Eventually, I recognized that my definition of family adjusted itself. I no longer described Linda as a relative whose presence deserved accommodation. She made a choice that prioritized personal opportunity over a child's safety. That choice transformed her identity in my mind. I did not need to label her. I did not need to correct her. I simply removed the emotional title from my vocabulary. Bruce faded in a similar pattern. He did not attempt to defend a privilege that no longer existed. He did not attempt to negotiate. That simplicity felt conclusive. Over time, I experienced gratitude for the absence of explanation. When adults choose to protect a child, they do not require approval from those who jeopardize that safety. They require consistency. I reinforced my boundaries through daily habits. I preserved documentation receipts, appointment summaries, and label screenshots. I taught Mason that curiosity only works when supported by verification. He enjoyed the structure because it gave him a map. He asked questions without fear of rejection. He learned how to evaluate rather than absorb. Those changes proved more valuable than punishment. I did not reclaim Linda as family, not because of anger, but because family should reflect reliability. If trust fractures, vocabulary must shift with it. I moved forward with a steadiness I did not anticipate. Months created perspective. Perspective created closure. Some boundaries must be established inside a household because not every relative qualifies for proximity to a child's vulnerability. Respect for law is not an inconvenience. Verification is not paranoia. Safety does not negotiate with personal gain. If an adult wants access to a child, they must demonstrate responsibility rather than entitlement. Titles do not exempt someone from accountability. I learned that affection cannot compensate for risk, and silence is healthier than tolerance when trust collapses. Thank you for staying through the final section of this story. I invite you to share your reaction in the comments. When a child's safety is threatened by someone who shares your bloodline, would you remain silent or intervene without hesitation? I want to read every opinion because accountability grows when others refuse to ignore misconduct. Speak clearly. Your voice could encourage someone who still feels uncertain.